A few hours ago, the White House authorized the largest single emergency military aid package to Ukraine in over a year, $2.3 billion deployed so rapidly that the announcement came within 6 hours of its trigger. What prompted this? Vladimir Putin issued what intelligence officials are calling an executable ultimatum. Ukraine must withdraw from territories Russia claims as its own. NATO must stop all weapon shipments, or face what Moscow explicitly described as all means at Russia's disposal. That phrasing, according to defense analysts, universally signals nuclear options are on the table. For Americans, this matters because it represents the most direct nuclear threat in the conflict since it began, and how Washington responds right now could determine whether nuclear blackmail becomes a standard tool of international diplomacy or whether it gets shut down before it spreads. The timeline reveals just how prepared U.S. intelligence was for this moment. Before Putin even spoke publicly, American satellites detected Russian mobile launch systems platforms capable of carrying tactical nuclear warheads being moved from positions they'd held for 18 months. Early warning radar networks that had been dormant suddenly activated. Encrypted communications spiked between strategic command facilities. According to Pentagon sources who briefed reporters under anonymity rules, these aren't routine movements. Russia only repositions these specific assets when it wants to send an unmistakable message. The question intelligence agencies couldn't immediately answer: was this theater meant to intimidate or preparation for actual use? When Putin delivered his ultimatum hours later, he wasn't vague. He demanded specific territorial concessions, immediate cessation of Western arms flows, and attached a deadline implied by the phrase irreversible consequences. State Department officials characterized the move as the kind of coercive diplomacy that, if successful, would fundamentally rewrite how nuclear powers negotiate. Think of it this way. If threatening nuclear action gets you territorial concessions, every nuclear-armed country suddenly has a new playbook for getting what it wants. That's why the American response wasn't just about Ukraine, it was about preventing a precedent. The $2.3 billion package wasn't standard resupply. According to Pentagon disclosures, it includes long-range ATACMS missiles that can strike over 180 miles deep into Russian-held territory, additional Patriot air defense batteries to protect Ukrainian cities, and, crucially, munitions for F-16 operations that had previously been restricted specifically to avoid escalation. Defense analysts note these are the kinds of weapons you authorize when you're willing to change battlefield calculations, not just sustain current positions. Washington also approved targeting parameters that allow Ukraine to hit logistical hubs and command centers inside Russian-occupied zones, the very infrastructure that would make Putin's ultimatum operationally feasible. Here's what makes the speed significant. This wasn't a reactive scramble. According to intelligence officials, contingency plans for exactly this scenario have been wargamed for months. What if Putin tries nuclear coercion? What if he demands territorial surrender under threat? The interagency process involving the Pentagon, State Department, National Security Council, and key congressional leaders had already mapped out response options. When the moment arrived, the decision was executed in hours rather than weeks. That kind of coordination requires institutional depth. It also sends a message to Moscow: we anticipated this move, we're not intimidated, and we've already calculated several steps ahead. NATO allies moved in parallel. Within the same window, European partners addressed specific vulnerabilities in Ukraine's air defense network that had emerged over the past month. Intelligence sharing across Eastern Europe reportedly increased surveillance of Russian nuclear forces by 300%. France, Germany, and the UK issued a joint statement calling Russia's ultimatum incompatible with responsible nuclear state behavior. Diplomatic language that translates to "this is unacceptable" and carries consequences. The coordination wasn't accidental. It demonstrated exactly what Putin was testing, whether nuclear threats would fracture Western unity or cement it. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded with a speech that was both measured and defiant, stating his country would not negotiate under the shadow of nuclear blackmail and that every ultimatum from Moscow only strengthens their resolve. That's not just rhetoric for domestic consumption. It signals to Washington and Brussels that Ukraine won't accept a settlement imposed by fear, which matters because some European voices have periodically suggested territorial compromises to end the fighting. Zelensky's position makes clear that any negotiation will happen on terms of strength, not coercion. But Putin's ultimatum didn't happen in isolation. Within the same 72-hour period, Belarus announced joint military exercises on Ukraine's northern border. Iran confirmed new shipments of Shahed drone components to Russia, and intelligence reports indicate North Korea accelerated artillery ammunition deliveries to Russian ports. When Moscow synchronizes moves across multiple fronts like this, analysts say it typically precedes a major operational push. Three possibilities are being debated in defense circles. Putin is preparing a large-scale spring offensive to seize more territory before negotiations. He's trying to freeze the conflict along current lines by demonstrating the costs of continued fighting. Or, the scenario worrying officials most, he's attempting to normalize nuclear threats as a legitimate diplomatic tool. Washington's response appears designed to foreclose that third option. By reinforcing Ukraine's conventional capabilities so dramatically and so quickly, the U.S. is essentially saying nuclear threats won't produce concessions, they'll produce more support for your opponent. That's deterrence theory in practice. You don't deter nuclear blackmail by matching nuclear rhetoric that just escalates the spiral. You deter it by ensuring the blackmail doesn't work, which means making sure Ukraine can defend itself and counterattack effectively using conventional means. The domestic pressure Putin faces makes this moment particularly volatile. Hardline nationalist voices in Russia had been demanding faster territorial gains and visible victories. Economic advisors want sanctions relief. The conflict has cost Russia an estimated 350,000 casualties, according to Western intelligence assessments. And while Russian military production has ramped up, the long-term economic strain is undeniable. When leaders face this kind of internal pressure while managing a war that isn't going as planned, they don't always make rational calculations. Sometimes they double down. Sometimes they escalate, hoping for a breakthrough. And sometimes they take risks that outside observers would consider irrational. That's why the next 72 to 96 hours are critical. Intelligence agencies will be watching whether Russia repositions forces in ways that indicate preparation for a major offensive, whether nuclear posture changes suggest actual readiness versus signaling, and whether there's any back-channel diplomatic activity indicating Moscow is looking for an exit ramp. NATO will be monitoring whether European unity holds or whether voices emerge calling for concessions to reduce nuclear risk, and everyone will be watching Ukraine's battlefield response. Whether they utilize the new weapon systems effectively, whether morale holds despite the nuclear rhetoric, and whether they demonstrate the kind of resilience that has defined their resistance for nearly 3 years. Right now, all indicators show unity. NATO allies are holding firm. Ukraine is not retreating. In fact, Ukrainian forces have intensified operations in several sectors over the past 48 hours. The United States has backed up commitments with concrete military support delivered at speed. But resolve is easy to declare and harder to sustain. It requires continued funding, which means congressional appropriations. It requires public support, which means Americans understanding why this matters beyond Ukraine's borders, and it requires strategic clarity about what's actually at stake. What's at stake isn't just whether Ukraine retains territory in the Donbass or Crimea. What's at stake is whether nuclear-armed countries can use weapons of mass destruction as a diplomatic lever to extract concessions. As that becomes normalized, every regional dispute involving a nuclear power suddenly has a new dimension. Think about that in the context of U.S. security interests, China and Taiwan, North Korea and South Korea, Pakistan and India. If nuclear threats work in Ukraine, they become the template elsewhere. That's why multiple administrations, regardless of party, have maintained that nuclear coercion cannot be allowed to succeed. It's not about any particular piece of Ukrainian territory. It's about the rules that prevent wars between major powers from going nuclear. Some Americans might reasonably ask, is supporting Ukraine worth the risk of nuclear escalation? That's a legitimate question that deserves a serious answer rather than dismissal. Defense strategists argue the calculation works like this. If you back down to nuclear threats, You guarantee more nuclear threats because you've just proven they work. If you call the bluff while providing conventional support, you force the other side to choose between following through, which would bring catastrophic consequences. They know they can't survive. Or backing down. It's a dangerous game, but the alternative, they argue, is worse. A world where any country with nuclear weapons can redraw borders by threatening to use them. The counter-argument, voiced by some foreign policy analysts, is that pushing a nuclear power into a corner creates unpredictable risks, and that providing Ukraine with longer-range weapons to strike deeper into Russian territory could trigger the very escalation everyone wants to avoid. This debate is real, it's happening in policy circles, and there's no perfect answer. What we can observe is that Washington has chosen the strategy of supporting Ukraine's conventional defense while maintaining that nuclear use would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict without specifying exactly what that response would be. The ambiguity is intentional, designed to preserve deterrence by keeping Russia uncertain about consequences. Putin's calculation tonight failed on its own terms. The ultimatum was designed to split Western support by raising the stakes to a level where democracies, with their messy politics and diverse public opinions, would fracture under pressure. Instead, the opposite happened. The response was unified, swift, and substantial. NATO is more coordinated now than at almost any point since the Cold War began. European countries are increasing military contributions rather than reducing them. And the United States just announced its largest emergency aid package in over a year, during a period of significant domestic political debate about foreign spending. That tells you something about how seriously Washington views the threat. When the national security establishment moves this quickly across multiple agencies with this level of coordination, it reflects a judgment that core interests are at stake. Whether you agree with that judgment or not, it's important to understand the reasoning behind it. Allowing nuclear blackmail to succeed would create a more dangerous world for American interests, not a safer one. As this unfolds over the coming days, we'll be tracking several key indicators. First, Russia's military movements or forces being positioned for a major offensive, or is this primarily signaling? Second, NATO cohesion. Do European allies maintain support, or do cracks appear? Third, Ukraine's battlefield performance with the new weapon systems. Can they demonstrate that Western support translates into military effectiveness? And fourth, any signs of diplomatic activity that might indicate Moscow is looking for a way to step back from the ultimatum without appearing to capitulate. Right now, Ukraine is still fighting. America has demonstrated its willingness to back up commitments with rapid, substantial military support. Putin's ultimatum hasn't produced the surrender he demanded or the Western fracture he hoped for. What happens next depends largely on decisions made in Moscow over the next few days, whether to escalate further, continue current operations while adjusting rhetoric, or find some way to retreat from this position. Each option carries significant risks, and none of them are good for Putin's strategic position. The fundamental test happening right now is whether coercion can succeed against a united democratic alliance that understands what's at stake. Tonight, that alliance held firm. The architecture of deterrence that has prevented great power conflicts since World War II remains intact. Whether it stays that way will depend on sustained coordination, continued support, and clarity about why this matters, not just for Ukraine, but for the international system that prevents conflicts between major powers from spiraling into catastrophe.